Something extraordinary is happening inside the British monarchy right now, and what most people are missing is that this isn't really about Prince Harry at all, not in the way it's being framed, not as a family squabble or a prodigal son narrative, but as a moment when an ancient institution is attempting to reassert control in an era where control no longer behaves the way it used to, and what we're watching unfold is a stress fracture, quiet but unmistakable, inside one of the world's oldest power structures. And this isn't just another round of palace intrigue designed to feed tabloids and evaporate by the next news cycle, because what's being reported, a private, hand-delivered letter from King Charles giving his son 30 days to choose a future, signals something far more consequential. A line being drawn not just between father and son, but between institution and individual, between inherited authority and modern autonomy. And as phones light up in London newsrooms and aides whisper in rooms that feel more like pressure chambers than offices, the atmosphere is thick with something familiar to anyone who studies power under strain. Because deadlines are rarely about time and almost always about dominance, because according to multiple sources, this letter was direct and unequivocal, delivered not through public channels but through a senior aide across an ocean, which tells you immediately this wasn't meant to persuade but to conclude, not to negotiate but to finalize, and that choice of method matters more than the words themselves. And what makes this unsettling is not the content of the ultimatum, return under palace terms or leave permanently, but the absence of a middle ground, because institutions that eliminate compromise are often signaling insecurity, not confidence. And this is where the story becomes larger than one prince, because the monarchy has spent the last several years insisting it can modernize while remaining unchanged, insisting flexibility while enforcing rigidity. And this moment exposes a contradiction, and behind closed doors, this isn't being discussed as an emotional reckoning, but as an administrative necessity, a way to streamline, to clarify, to impose order after years of reputational leakage caused in debt by interviews, memoirs, lawsuits, and the uncomfortable fact that a former insider has been narrating the institution from the outside, because Prince Harry didn't just leave royal duties in 2020, he carried with him credibility, proximity, and a willingness to describe internal dynamics in human terms. And that's why this matters. And not because the monarchy can't survive criticism, but because it struggles to survive ambiguity. And here's what few people realize. Monarchies, like all long-lived institutions, rely less on affection than on predictability, on clearly defined roles that the public can understand and accept without thinking too hard. And when someone exists in between, royal but not working, titled but independent, funded but critical, that ambiguity becomes corrosive. And so this reported deadline is not an act of cruelty or reconciliation, but an act of boundary enforcement, a signal that the institution is done absorbing shock and is now hardening its edges. And this is where history whispers in the background. Because whenever monarchies feel compelled to issue ultimatums, it's usually because informal authority has stopped working. And that's the real story unfolding here. Not a family drama, but an institution confronting the limits of its own control in a world that no longer agrees to play by inherited rules. And this is where the significance deepens, because once you strip away the palace silence and the careful non-denials, a pattern emerges that explains why this reported letter exists at all and why it arrives now rather than earlier or later. And according to people familiar with the internal process, this ultimatum didn't materialize suddenly, but followed months of internal memoranda, legal consultations, and quiet discussions about titles, funding structures, and precedent. Because the monarchy doesn't act impulsively, it acts when ambiguity becomes administratively expensive. And what makes this moment revealing is that the palace has tolerated tension for years, tolerated public criticism through televised interviews, tolerated the publication of a memoir that detailed private conversations and emotional grievances, and tolerated ongoing litigation against the British press. But only until those actions began intersecting with institutional authority rather than personal narrative, because behind the scenes, officials were less concerned with the emotional tone of Harry's claims than with their structural implications, the way they complicated the monarchy's messaging discipline, and blurred the line between official representation and private speech. And this is not the first time the House of Windsor has responded to that kind of ambiguity with finality, because history shows a recurring pattern where royal institutions allow deviation until deviation threatens coherence, at which point boundaries are enforced abruptly. And what makes this psychologically significant is that King Charles, unlike his mother, governs less through stoic endurance and more through managed systems, which means he views unresolved arrangements not as human complexity, but as organizational failure. And that's why this matters. And because the reported meeting last year between father and son, ostensibly about legal matters, ended without agreement, it confirms something officials already feared, that reconciliation without submission was unlikely. And while publicly the palace maintained neutrality, privately aides were mapping outcomes, calculating how titles function under British law, and considering how a permanent separation could be framed as necessity rather than punishment. And this is where Prince Harry's role becomes symbolically dangerous, because he represents a hybrid identity. The monarchy cannot absorb royal by birth, yet autonomous by choice, loyal to family but critical of structure, and institutions built on hierarchy do not know how to metabolize that contradiction. And not because dissent is forbidden, but because dissent from former insiders carries a different weight, a credibility that external critics never possess. And what few realize is that this pressure is not only downward toward Harry, but upward toward Charles himself, because a monarch who cannot define the limits of his own household appears administratively weak, and weakness inside symbolic institutions spreads faster than scandal. And this is where pattern recognition becomes unavoidable, because every modern monarchy that has survived reform has done so by narrowing participation, clarifying roles, and eliminating gray zones, even when that process is painful and publicly messy. And what makes this truly consequential is that this ultimatum, if real and enforced, signals that the monarchy has chosen coherence over reconciliation, order over flexibility, and institutional survival over emotional repair. And while that choice may stabilize the system in the short term, it also reveals an institution that no longer believes it can persuade its own members to comply voluntarily. And this is where the story moves beyond family and into governance, because when power stops negotiating and starts imposing deadlines, is not acting from strength, it's acting from necessity. And that brings us to what happens next, because what follows this decision won't simply resolve a conflict, it will accelerate consequences that are already forming beneath the surface. But what makes this truly dangerous is what's happening at the next layer. And while the surface narrative continues to frame this as a personal reckoning between father and son, something far more consequential is building beneath it, because what's actually being stress tested is whether the modern monarchy can enforce boundaries without accelerating its own fragility. And because once an ultimatum is issued, even an unofficial one, it becomes a countdown, not just for Prince Harry, but for the institution itself, forcing every actor involved to choose between escalation and capitulation. And this is where the facade cracks, because a streamlined monarchy sounds orderly in theory, but becomes brittle in practice when it collides with global media, independent wealth, and a former insider who no longer needs institutional permission to be heard. And what's truly alarming is that the palace's leverage is narrower than it appears, because while King Charles III holds symbolic authority over titles and duties, he does not control platforms, public sympathy, or the broader cultural appetite for narratives about power and exit. And because every move to formalize separation risks validating the very critique the institution wants to contain, that it prioritizes control over care and optics over reconciliation. And this is where the deeper problem emerges. Because if Prince Harry accepts the terms and returns under restrictions, the monarchy must absorb a visibly constrained figure whose compliance will always appear coerced. And if he refuses, the institution must execute a punitive severance that confirms it cannot tolerate dissent without erasure, and either outcome narrows the future, not just for one prince, but for how the monarchy handles deviation going forward. And behind the scenes, this is already creating institutional stress, because aides are forced to plan for legal recalibrations. Communications teams are rehearsing language that frames exclusion as modernization. And courtiers are quietly acknowledging that the public no longer interprets royal authority the way it once did. And this isn't about celebrity fallout, it's about precedent. And because in any previous era, a royal stepping outside the system could be marginalized quietly. But in this era, marginalization becomes content, monetized and amplified, feeding a feedback loop that the institution cannot shut down. And this is where power dynamics invert, because the monarchy depends on ritual silence while Prince Harry operates fluently in a world that rewards disclosure, emotion, and narrative ownership. And the cost of this will be cumulative, because each assertion of institutional authority invites scrutiny of its legitimacy, and each attempt to close ranks highlights the distance between symbolic unity and lived reality. And not because the monarchy is about to collapse, but because normalization is the real danger here. The slow acceptance that ultimatums, exclusions, and hard boundaries are the only tools left. And once that becomes normal, flexibility becomes weakness and empathy becomes liability. And this is where the stakes widen, because institutions that cannot adapt internally often externalize conflict, projecting stability while hollowing themselves out, and what looked solid begins to feel thin. And that's why this moment is no longer about resolving a family dispute. It's about whether the monarchy can navigate modern pluralism without defaulting to coercion. And as the deadline approaches, the real escalation isn't Terry's decision. It's the institution's exposure, because whatever happens next will reveal not just what the monarchy demands, but what it can no longer control. And this is where the story ultimately lands, because what we are witnessing right now is not a private family decision wrapped in royal ceremony, but a public demonstration of how legacy institutions behave when the world they were designed to command no longer automatically complies. And because once you step back from the personalities and the headlines, the deeper reality comes into focus, that this moment is about authority negotiating its relevance under modern conditions. And that negotiation is not going well. And this isn't about whether Prince Harry returns or walks away. It's about whether the monarchy still possesses a functional middle space between obedience and exile. And that's why this matters. And because history is unforgiving to institutions that mistake control for legitimacy, this moment carries weight far beyond 30 days or a single letter. And what's truly alarming is that the monarchy appears to believe clarity will save it, when clarity imposed without consent often accelerates decline rather than preventing it. And this is where historical context sharpens the warning, because monarchies that survive periods of change do so by expanding symbolic inclusion, even as a narrow formal power, not by drawing hard lines that transform internal disagreement into external spectacle. And behind the scenes, the calculation is clear, that a clean break is administratively easier than sustained ambiguity. that a decisive rupture can be managed, branded, and eventually normalized, and not because it heals wounds, but because it simplifies governance. And this is where the audience's role becomes unavoidable, because institutions do not exist in isolation. They survive on public recognition, cultural patience, and collective agreement to suspend disbelief. And once people begin to see ultimatums instead of stewardship, rigidity instead of resilience, that suspension weakens. And the cost of this will not be immediate or dramatic. There will be no sudden collapse or ceremonial reckoning, but erosion is rarely plowed. It is cumulative. And this is where the facade truly cracks. Because a monarchy that frames dissent as disloyalty teaches future members that silence is safer than honesty, and compliance is valued over trust. And what makes this dangerous is that systems trained that way lose their internal corrective mechanisms, their ability to self-adjust before pressure becomes crisis. And this isn't about sides, it's about structure. And the question is no longer whether Prince Harry will respond to the deadline, it's whether the monarchy understands what it has revealed by issuing one. And history tells us that institutions fail not when challenged from outside, but when they can no longer absorb complexity from within. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. And because the real story here is not resolution, but exposure, the kind that forces audiences to reconsider what power looks like when tradition collides with transparency. And this moment matters because it asks a harder question than loyalty or rebellion. It asks whether inherited authority can still adapt without resorting to coercion. And the answer to that question will not arrive in a press release or a palace briefing. It will emerge slowly through consequences, perceptions, and the quiet recalibration of public belief. And that's why attention matters, and that's why understanding matters, and that's why this story doesn't end cleanly here.